Welcome back again, everyone. My name is Åsa Verhagen, and I'm a professor at the Technical University of Denmark, and very happy to introduce our next keynote speaker. Sara Gerke is an assistant professor of law at Penn State, where she does research on the ethical and legal challenges of AI, in particular for healthcare and health law, within both the US and in Europe. She has a degree in law from Augsburg, a PhD from Mannheim, also in law, and she has since had a position as research fellow at Harvard Law School. Today, she will give a talk on Towards Transparency, Creating Labeling Standards for AI and ML-based medical devices, and we really look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me. I do have some slides. I'm going to share them and then we can get started. Can you already see my slides?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, perfect. So my title of my today's presentation is Towards Transparency, Creating Labeling Standards for AI/ML-based medical devices. And before I get started, again, I would like to thank the organizers of the workshop, especially Andy King, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present my work. Now, my presentation today is based on a recent paper of mine, which was published in the George Washington Law Review. And so I thought in the next around 20 minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of my main argument, and then tell you why this is important. And then I will focus on my central findings and claims. Now, let's start with my main argument. So my main argument is that there is an urgent need for labeling standards for AI/ML-based medical devices, and that the FDA in the United States, so the Food and Drug Administration, should really develop these standards with input from all stakeholders as soon as possible. And so why are labeling standards important? They are important because AI is rapidly entering healthcare and may fundamentally change the way physicians practice medicine in the future. So to date, there is no universal definition of AI, but the term is often used as an umbrella term that encompasses several subsets. So there is, in particular, its subset machine learning, which has become one of the most promising fields of computer science in recent years. And machine learning uses algorithms to detect patterns in data. And then there's a subset of machine learning, which is called deep learning, which identifies data patterns by employing artificial neural networks with lots of layers. So far, the FDA in the United States has already permitted over 690 AI/ML-based medical devices. For example, this year's Luminetics Core was formerly called IDXDR. It's a medical device that uses AI to detect more than a mild level of diabetic retinopathy in diabetic patients. And so the peculiarity of this system is that it is considered autonomous, meaning that its decision does not need to be reviewed by the primary care physician. And this tool was already, this device was already been marketed in April 2018, and Luminetics Core has been deployed in over 20 sites across the US since then. In addition, according to one recent estimate, the global healthcare AI market size is forecasted to reach $51.3 billion by 2027. So that's a compound annual growth rate of 41.4% from 2020. And then in the health and research context, AI is also expected to be increasingly applied in 4 areas. So the first one is clinical care, such as medical imaging and disease diagnostics. The second one is direct-to-consumer uses, such as health AI apps ranging from diet guidance to psychological advice, fitness trackers, etc. And then the third one is research and development process. So here we have the acceleration of the drug and vaccine discovery process, but also higher efficiency of clinical trials. And then the last one is workflow optimization. So, for example, the reduction of costs and clinical documentation time. Now, Labeling is crucial to prevent harm to patients and consumers, such as by reducing the risk of bias, and also ensure that users know how to properly use the device and also assess its benefits, potential risks, and limitations. So labeling can really promote autonomous decisions regarding the use of the device. And it can also create legal clarity for manufacturers, transparency to users, and it can also help facilitate public trust in new digital health technologies. Now, let's shift to my central findings and claims. So in my paper, I make 6 central findings and claims, and I will introduce each of those in the following briefly. Now, the first is that I argue that the long-awaited clinical decision support software guidance in the United States seems to violate the 21st Century Cures Act and create significant uncertainty for IML manufacturers regarding whether their product is considered a medical device, and it also raises safety concerns. Okay, so what do I mean by this? To understand it a little better, I provide some background. So if an AML-based product is classified as a medical device in the US, the FDA can regulate it. And so I have included here the definition of a medical device, which is found in section 201H, paragraph 1 of the US Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, especially the parts that I've highlighted here in bold are important. So medical device is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action within or on the body of man, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. Now, the last sentence of this definition here is particularly relevant for AI, and it is because it clearly states that the term device does not include software functions excluded pursuant to section 520(0). So what this means is that in general, the term medical device also includes software functions, but there are some software functions that are not considered to be medical devices. And section 520 of the US Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act mentions 5 categories of software functions that are not classified as medical devices. And this means they are not subject to FDA regulation. Namely, the first one here is administrative support of healthcare facilities. The second, maintenance or encouragement of healthy lifestyles. So many health apps fall under this exception. The third one is serve as electronic patient records. Then we have transfer, store, convert, formats, or display data and results. And then finally, the clinical decision support software. So in particular here, the second and the fifth categories are especially relevant for IML-based products. And I will focus on the clinical decision support software exception in the following. So some clinical decision support software tools are not classified as medical devices, and that really means they are not subject to FDA regulation. And in September last year, the FDA issued the long-awaited clinical decision support software guidance to clarify the agency's regulatory approach to clinical decision support software functions. Now, there are 4 criteria that need to be fulfilled for a software function to fall under this exception. Now, the blue boxes here show the wording of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the black boxes show the FDA's interpretation of these 4 criteria in its final guidance. And without going into the details here, I show in my paper that the final clinical decision support software guidance seems to violate the 21st Century Cures Act, by adding really novel concepts to the statutory language, which impacts what products are regulated as medical devices. So the guidance also did not contribute to clarity, but rather to confusion among stakeholders, especially manufacturers, regarding whether their product is considered a medical device, and it also raises safety concerns. So in particular, under criterion 4, a clinical decision support software can only fall under the medical device exception if it is intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional and enabling such healthcare professional to independently review the basis for such recommendations that such software presents, so that it's not the intent that such healthcare professional rely primarily on any of such recommendations to make a clinical diagnosis or treatment decision regarding an individual patient. So this vague term here, independently review the basis for such recommendations, opens many possibilities for interpretation. And of course, AI companies are trying very hard not to fall under the medical device definition. What is positive is that under the new guidance, manufacturers are incentivized to improve their labels, particularly by listing information on the underlying algorithm development and validation in order to be able to fall under the medical device exception. But the FDA's newest interpretation of criterion 4 also brings with it many uncertainties for AI manufacturers and also safety concerns. So to give you like an example, so the previous clinical decision support software draft guidance still explained that in order to describe the basis for a recommendation, the software developer should include plain language descriptions of the logic or rationale used by an algorithm to render a recommendation. So what this means is that the previous CDS draft guidance suggested that clinical decision support software tools using black box AI were unlikely to fall under the medical device exception. And many health AI-based products that are available on the US market are black boxes. So these are algorithms typically labeled as deep learning, and they are considered black boxes because it's very difficult, if not impossible, for humans to understand them. And so manufacturers are not able, in most cases, to describe the logic or rationale used by the algorithm to render a recommendation. And so under the previous clinical decision support software draft guidance, clinical decision support software tools using black box AI, so using deep learning, were likely a priori considered to be medical devices and thus were generally subject to FDA regulation. But now, interestingly, the new final clinical decision support software guidance no longer mentions the term rationale at all. Instead, the FDA now recommends a summary of the logic or methods relied upon to provide the recommendation, and then mentions AIML techniques as an example. And so the final guidance suggests that the FDA has moved away from its previous thinking in its draft guidance, and it seems now that all types of AI machine learning, even black box model, can now fulfill criterion 4 in principle, and so could potentially fall under the medical device exception. And it's really likely that the FDA deliberately dropped the term rationale from its new guidance and replaced it with the word method. Now, this interpretation is also supported by statements made by the then director of the FDA's Digital Health Center of Excellence, Brandon O'Leary, at the time the new guidance was published. And he said, and this is a quote, that we have gotten to that place where it is possible for certain artificial deep neural networks, so black boxes, artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to meet the statutory criteria for exclusion from the device definition, end of quote. So the FDA's new interpretation is really highly questionable and concerning, because it's more than unclear to me how black box AI can fulfill the statutory requirement of enabling such healthcare professionals to independently review the basis for such recommendations that such software presents. Now, second, what I show in my article is that I established that there are currently no standards of labeling for AI/ML-based medical devices. And I argue that that's really concerning, because AI/ML-based medical devices differ in many aspects from traditional medical devices, such as contact lenses. So, for example, first of all, we need to ask the question, what is labeling even? So the term is defined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in the US, and as all labels and other written, printed, or graphic matter upon any article or any of its containers or wrappers or accompanying such article. So what this means is it's an umbrella term, yeah, that includes all labels. And most AI/ML-based medical devices are so-called software as a medical device, or SAMD. So what this means is it's standalone software. And so the software itself is the medical device. And because of that, the label will usually be available in non-physical form through the software itself. Now, there are 6 parts of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and 6 parts contain labeling requirements here for medical devices, which are listed here. Now, AI/ML-based medical devices are categorized into one of 3 classes. We have a class 1, class 2, or class 3, and that's based on their risk, so low, moderate, or high. And so the regulatory controls increase the higher the classification of the device. So class 1 devices are subject to so-called general controls. Class 2 devices are subject to general and special controls if available. And then class 3 devices, so the highest risk class, are subject to general controls and so-called pre-market approval, or PMA. Now, the general device labeling requirements that I listed here and are laid down in part 801 are an example of so-called general controls, and so usually apply to all medical devices, including AI/ML-based ones. But I show in my paper that Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations does not contain specific labeling requirements for AI/ML-based medical devices. And I argue in my paper that that's concerning because AI/ML-based medical devices differ really in many aspects from traditional medical devices, such as contact lenses. So for example, AI/ML-based medical devices can be biased. There are different types of biases, including bias in the training data, label choice bias, contextual bias, and also unconscious bias. And some AI/ML-based medical devices are also black boxes and/or are adaptive and can continuously learn from new data. And then also, the more human AI interaction takes place, the more difficult it is actually to predict how AI/ML-based medical devices will perform in the real world once they are launched on the market. And so that's why I argue that labeling standards for AI/ML-based medical devices are really urgently needed, because the current existing labeling requirements which we have for medical devices and the FDA's case-by-case approach for a few AI/ML-based medical devices are insufficient. A recent study showed that out of the total of 161 legally marketed AI-based medical devices in the US, only 7, so get this, only 7 provided publicly available race ethnicity information, and only 13 disclosed gender information. And then in addition, most manufacturers did also not report information on the amount of data used to validate the device's performance or their geographic breakdown. And so this study here clearly confirms that the current labeling requirements, which we have for medical devices in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, are insufficient. And without labeling standards for AI/ML-based medical devices, many users are left in the dark about a lot of important information, such as gender, race, ethnicity, and geographic breakdowns of the data sets used. And without this information, patients' health may be jeopardized by really unnecessary treatment and also biased care. And even in the few cases where the FDA actually required special labeling requirements through so-called special controls, those are not enough. So the FDA typically requests special controls for class 2 medical devices in the so-called de novo process. But the problem is that only 21 so far of over 690 marketed AI/ML-based medical devices have undergone such a process. And in addition, most of those devices that went through the de novo process of these 21 did not report gender and race ethnicity breakdowns. An example is a device which is called Brain Scope, used by emergency physicians to assess patients with head injuries for brain concussion. And even if we would say, okay, the FDA were to always require such a disclosure through the de novo special controls, the problem is that almost all AI/ML-based medical devices would be cleared through the so-called 510K process, and thus usually only would have to comply with the labeling requirements in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, that's why I argue that 11 key types of information should be included on the label of all AI/ML-based medical devices, and those include the model identifiers, the model type, model characteristics, indications for use, validation and model performance, preparation before use and application, model limitations, warnings and precautions, alternative choices, privacy and security, and then also additional information. I don't have time to go into the details here, but for example, as seen, users really need to receive details on the data sets, such as gender and race ethnicity breakdowns. And this list should also not be considered exhaustive, but should serve as a helpful starting point for the FDA to begin the overdue development of labeling standards for AI/ML-based medical devices. And during this process, the FDA should maintain an ongoing dialogue with all stakeholders, including patient and consumer representatives. And in addition to creating general labeling standards for all AI/ML-based medical devices as a first step, the FDA should also consider in a second and a third step whether additional labeling standards are needed for specific types of AI and/or intended users. Now, my fifth claim is that nutrition facts labels known from food products are promising a label design for AI/ML-based medical devices. So for adaptive algorithms, the label, so these are the ones which can continuously learn from new data. The label should also be dynamic, rather than static, meaning it really needs to be continuously updated. A nutrition facts label has the advantage that its design is familiar to users and allows them to get a quick overview of all key information. And then lastly, labeling for AI/ML-based medical devices must be coupled with educational campaigns and also other needed regulatory reforms for AI/ML-based medical devices, many of which I've already discussed in some of my previous works. I know I'm running out of time, so I will stop here. And thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Wow, that was quite amazing. Thank you. I think we're all quite amazed by this. I think also it's important to clarify for maybe people just coming into the conversation that when our speaker says labels, she means the nutrition facts at the end of the presentation, whereas in machine learning, we often think of labels being data point wise or annotations in an image. But yeah, the discussion of the nutrition facts, I feel like this is relevant, of course, just legally to all of us now if we're in this field, but pertinent to our research and our interests. We have a question from the Q&A. And I think I'll summarize it here. So the techniques are growing rapidly, and regulations, clearly will have to necessarily lag behind the state of the art. So this question asks essentially, can you audit in-house research? But I think I'll expand that even further. How do we design regulation that is flexible enough for innovation, but also actually imposes some type of regulation, right? Is this possible?
Yeah. I think that's not something like new with regard to AI. We have always that issue with technology in general, or medical developments in general, that the law is often lagging behind and so needs to catch up. That's always with innovation, has always been, so that's nothing new, but I think we still always manage to get a regulatory framework in place. Of course, we don't want to over-regulate. There are a lot of, one needs to find like a balance between the different stakeholders, and we want to promote innovation, don't want to over-regulate, but not having enough regulation is also potentially very harmful. And so it is definitely a challenge. And I think you know, often with hard and soft law, in a way, one can find like a balance. You know, once one has a proper regulatory framework in place, a lot can be done by guidance. So the FDA, for example, in the US, likes to do a lot of regulation through guidance documents, because they are considered a recommendation, but in reality, that's what you should do, and they have like a much more higher impact. And so manufacturers have to do that to get actually through pre-market review, but it gives the FDA the flexibility to quickly update those guidance documents if there's like if there are new developments, new techniques, and especially in the field of AI. That flexibility is going to be needed, but also in the if we are looking at Europe, there are ways through having a proper regulatory framework, and then other directives or ordinances that could be updated at a quicker time to address the new developments.
Okay, so yeah, guidance. Yeah, that sounds promising. Are there potential fields that we can look to already that have similar technological issues or technological development, but also successful legislation? So examples from other places.
I mean, I think like the most obvious one is at the end of the day, drug regulation. Yeah, medicine and products regulation, you know, has always been a hugely regulated, but still, once we usually we are requiring clinical trials. Once a drug went through clinical trials, we usually know, even if we don't know how it works, and we don't know how every drug works, we do know that that they are safe, reasonably safe and effective. Of course, there are always some risks involved, but we have properly tested them. While of course with AI, it's much more challenging than just requiring clinical trials. I mean, there are not many clinical trials yet for AI. That's in itself an issue. But then, of course, it's much more complicated than just having a drug and a tablet to swallow, because if AI is adaptive and we are not locking the algorithm, because most of the tools which FDA reviewed and allowed are all locked. So in the moment they want to update their algorithm, etc., they do need to go through another review through the FDA. So we don't really have really adaptive, continuously learning models out there yet. But of course, that's kind of like the idea of AI, that we use that potential, that it could do that. But that would require also continuous monitoring of those systems. And we don't. I don't think we have the have that in place yet. How to actually do that.
Okay, so I think that's answered our Q&A question and answered many of our questions here from the panel board.
Yeah.
If there are no more, I think we would all thank you again once more. That was amazing, and
thank you.